October 31st, 1944. The sun hung low over the Montana plains, casting long shadows across the converted cattle ranch that now served as a prisoner of war camp. Inside the main barracks, 43 German women watched through frosted windows as American guards carried tables, lanterns, and baskets of food toward the dining hall. The air crackled with tension and whispered speculation. Hilda Schneider pressed her face closer to the cold glass, her breath fogging the view. She had been a prisoner for 6 weeks, long enough to understand the rhythms of camp life, but nothing had prepared her for what she was witnessing now. The cowboy guards, usually casual in their duties, moved with purpose and excitement. They were decorating, celebrating something. Behind her, Liselotte Weber gripped Hilda's arm with trembling fingers. "Hilda," she whispered in German, her young voice thick with hope. "Do you think, could it be?" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't dare to speak the words aloud. But Hilda knew what she was asking. They all knew. For weeks, they had heard whispers through the camp grapevine about Allied advances, about German retreats, about cities falling. Could this celebration mean what they desperately hoped it meant? Had Germany surrendered? Was the war finally over? Katharina Fischer, the oldest among them, stood rigid near the door. Her nurse's training had taught her to remain calm in crisis, but even she couldn't hide the tremor in her hands. "We shouldn't assume," she said quietly, though her eyes betrayed the same desperate hope the others felt. "It could be anything. An American holiday we don't know about." But her words carried no conviction. Deep down, she wanted to believe as much as the youngest among them. Frida Hoffmann sat on her bunk, clutching the small diary she had managed to keep hidden throughout her capture. She had been documenting everything since their arrival: the fear, the uncertainty, the unexpected kindness of their captors. Now she wrote with shaking hands, "October 31st. Something is happening. The Americans are preparing a feast. Tables laden with food such as we haven't seen in months. Pumpkins, roasted meat, fresh bread. The guards are smiling, laughing. Sergeant Patterson himself is overseeing the preparations. Could this be the end? Could we finally go home?" Through the window, they watched as Private Jake McGraw, the young cowboy they had come to know as Dusty, carried an enormous roasted turkey toward the hall. He caught sight of the women watching and waved enthusiastically, his grin wide beneath his hat. The gesture sent a ripple of excitement through the barracks. Charlie Reeves followed behind him, struggling with a basket overflowing with rolls and what appeared to be pies. The abundance was staggering, especially after months of rationed meals. "They're celebrating," Liesl breathed, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "They must be celebrating the end. Why else would they prepare such a feast?" Other women gathered around the windows now, pressing close to see. Some were crying openly, others clutching each other in silent prayer. The possibility of going home, of seeing their families again, of leaving behind the uncertainty of captivity, it was almost too much to bear. 6 weeks earlier, on a crisp September morning, Hilda Schneider had stepped off a military transport truck onto soil that felt as foreign as the moon. The journey from the East Coast Processing Center had taken days, each mile carrying them further from anything resembling civilization as they knew it. When the canvas covers were finally pulled back, revealing their destination, several women had gasped audibly. This was not a prison camp. It was a ranch. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling plains of golden grass beneath a sky so vast and blue it seemed impossible. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Wooden fences marked pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, and the main compound consisted of converted barns and ranch buildings rather than the stark military structures they had expected. It looked nothing like the prisoner of war camps they had heard about, nothing like the military facilities they had served in back in Europe. Sergeant Roy Patterson had been waiting for them, standing beside the main gate with his arms crossed and his weathered face unreadable beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He wore his uniform, but even the military clothing couldn't hide what he truly was. This man was a cowboy, born and raised on these very plains. His boots were worn from stirrups, not parade grounds. His hands bore the calluses of ranch work, not rifle drills. When he spoke, his accent was thick with the drawl of the American West, so different from the clipped English they had studied in school. "Welcome to Camp Bitter Creek," he had announced in English, his voice carrying across the 10 group. A translator, a thin, nervous corporal from New York, repeated his words in halting German. "You'll be housed in the converted bunkhouses. You'll work in the kitchens, the laundry, and the administrative offices. You'll follow camp rules, respect the guards, and in return, you'll be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention and with human decency." Human decency. The phrase had struck Hilda as odd. She had expected threats, intimidation, the harsh treatment that prisoners of war deserved from their enemies. Instead, this cowboy sergeant spoke of decency, as if it were simply the natural order of things, as if treating prisoners well required no special justification. The guards who stepped forward to escort them to their quarters were equally unexpected. These weren't hardened combat soldiers fresh from European battlefields. They were ranch hands, farmers, and rodeo riders who had been drafted or enlisted and assigned to this remote facility. Private Jake McGraw, who they would soon know as Dusty, couldn't have been more than 24 years old. His face still held the openness of youth, unmarked by the brutality of war. When he reached to help an elderly prisoner carry her bag, she had flinched away, expecting a trick or a trap. "It's all right, ma'am," he had said gently, though she couldn't understand his words. His tone, however, needed no translation. He simply wanted to help. Eventually, cautiously, she had allowed it. Corporal Ben Sutherland, the ranch foreman turned military guard, had directed them to their quarters with quiet efficiency. Unlike Patterson, he seemed less comfortable with his military role. He kept adjusting his uniform as if it didn't quite fit right, and when he pointed toward the bunkhouses, his gesture was more suggestion than command. The first days at Camp Bitter Creek had been a study in confusion for both captors and captives. The Germanwomen, trained in the rigid hierarchy of military discipline, kept waiting for the harsh structure of prison life to reveal itself. Instead, they found themselves in a world that operated by entirely different rules. Rules that seemed to have more to do with ranch courtesy than military protocol. Hilda had been assigned to administrative duties in the main office, where she helped organize records and translated documents. On her third morning, Sergeant Patterson had walked in carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He set one on her desk without ceremony, nodded, and walked away. She had stared at the cup for a full minute, wondering if it was some kind of test. Was she allowed to drink it? Was it poisoned? Would accepting it mean something she didn't understand? Finally, she had taken a cautious sip. It was strong, black, and surprisingly good. When Patterson returned an hour later and saw the empty cup, he had simply smiled and said, "Figured you could use it. Mornings are cold out here." Liesel, assigned to kitchen work, experienced similar bewilderment. Charlie Reeves, the young private from Nebraska, had been tasked with supervising the prisoners in food preparation. But supervision seemed to be the last thing on his mind. Instead, he taught them how Americans cooked, demonstrating techniques with enthusiastic hand gestures and broken phrases. When Liesel accidentally burned a pan of biscuits, she had frozen in terror, expecting punishment. Charlie had simply laughed, dumped the blackened lumps into the compost, and said, "Happens to everyone. My ma burned more biscuits than she ever served perfect. Try again." The cultural differences revealed themselves in countless small moments. When Katharina reported to the medical facility, Doc Martha Hayes had looked her up and down with sharp, assessing eyes. "I hear you were a nurse," she had said through the translator. "Fairmacht Medical Corps." Katharina had nodded stiffly, expecting to be rejected, to have her skills dismissed or distrusted. Instead, Doc Hayes had handed her a stack of medical supplies. "Good. I need someone who knows what they're doing. These cowboys are always getting themselves hurt. Last week, Dusty tried to ride a half-broke horse and nearly split his head open. You know how to stitch?" The work assignments continued to puzzle the prisoners. They weren't being forced into hard labor or meaningless tasks designed to break their spirits. Instead, they were given real responsibilities, jobs that actually mattered to the camp's operation. Frida found herself working alongside Corporal Sutherland in the supply office, learning the complex system of inventory and requisitions. He treated her like a colleague rather than an enemy, asking her opinion on organization methods and actually implementing her suggestions when they made sense. But it was the informal nature of the guards that most unsettled them. These cowboys didn't maintain the proper distance between captor and captive. Dusty would lean against the kitchen doorframe and chat with the women during their breaks, talking about his family's ranch in Wyoming, about the horses he missed, about how his mother made the best apple pie in 3 counties. He showed them photographs from his wallet, pictures of his parents and his younger sister, who looked barely older than Liesl. The breaking point for Hilda came 3 weeks into their imprisonment, though it wasn't a breaking in the way she had feared. It was a Sunday afternoon, warm for late September, when Sergeant Patterson approached her in the yard. She had been sitting on a bench, trying to read an old German novel someone had found in the camp's small library. He stood there for a moment, hat in his hands, then asked through the translator, "Do you ride?" Hilda had looked up at him, confused. "Ride?" She repeated in careful English, one of the few words she knew. Patterson gestured toward the stables, where several horses stood in the corral. "Horses," he clarified. "Do you know how to ride horses?" She had shaken her head. In Munich, she had lived in the city. Horses were for the wealthy, or for farmers, not for clerks like her. Patterson had considered this for a moment, then said something that changed everything. "Would you like to learn?" An hour later, Hilda found herself standing beside a gentle mare named Rosie, while Patterson explained the basics of horsemanship. His patience was remarkable. When she struggled to mount, he didn't laugh or show frustration. He simply adjusted the stirrup and tried a different approach. When she finally sat in the saddle, trembling with fear and exhilaration, he walked beside her, one hand on the bridle, talking in a low, steady voice. "That's it. Just feel how she moves. Let your body move with hers. Nothing to be afraid of." Liesl's transformation came through music. One evening in the mess hall, Charlie Reeves had pulled out a battered harmonica and started playing. The tune was unfamiliar to the Germanwomen, something American and cheerful. Liesl had been washing dishes, but the music made her pause. Without thinking, she began to hum along, finding the melody instinctively. Charlie had stopped playing and stared at her. "You sing?" he asked, his eyes lighting up. She had nodded shyly. He immediately launched into another song, simpler this time, and gestured for her to join in. Her voice, clear and pure, filled the hall. Other guards stopped what they were doing to listen. When she finished, there was genuine applause. From that evening on, music became a bridge between the two groups. Liesl taught them German folk songs, and they taught her American standards. The language barrier dissolved in harmony. She discovered that Dusty had a surprisingly good tenor voice, and that even the gruff Corporal Sutherland would hum along when he thought no one was listening. Music nights became informal gatherings where enemies forgot, for a few precious hours, that they were supposed to hate each other. Katharina's moment came in the medical bay. A ranch hand had been kicked by a horse, suffering a deep gash on his leg. Doc Hayes was treating another patient when the injured man stumbled in, bleeding heavily. Katharina had immediately taken charge, her training overriding any thought of her status as a prisoner. She cleaned the wound, applied pressure to stop the bleeding, and prepared the sutures before Doc Hayes could even finish with her other patient. The injured cowboy, pale but grateful, had looked up at her and said, "Thank you, ma'am." The sincerity in his voice made her hands shake. Here was an American thanking her, a German prisoner, for saving him from infection or worse. October arrived with a sudden cold snap that painted frost on the windows and reminded the Germanwomen how far they were from home. The Montana autumn was unlike anything they had experienced in Europe. The sky seemed larger somehow, the colors more vivid. Aspens on the distant hillsides turned brilliant gold, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching winter. It was beautiful and alien in equal measure. The first hints that something unusual was coming appeared in mid-October. Hilda noticed it during her administrative work when supply requisitions began to include strange items. Large quantities of pumpkins, orange and black crepe paper, candles, and vast amounts of sugar and flour, beyond the normal rations. When she asked Sergeant Patterson about it, he had simply smiled mysteriously and said, "You'll see. It's a surprise." The word surprise made her nervous. In her experience, surprises during wartime were rarely pleasant. Liesl observed the changes in the kitchen. Charlie Reeves and the other guards were planning some kind of special meal, consulting recipes and debating ingredients with unusual intensity. She caught fragments of English conversations that included words she didn't understand. Jack-o'-lantern, trick or treat, All Hallows Eve. When she asked what these phrases meant, Charlie had attempted to explain through gestures and simple words, but his description only confused her more. A holiday where children dressed in costumes and people carved faces into vegetables? It made no sense. Frida documented everything in her diary with growing anxiety. October 15th. The Americans are planning something elaborate. They work with excitement I haven't seen before. Private McGraw whistles while he works. Even Corporal Sutherland seems lighter somehow. Sergeant Patterson's wife has visited the camp 3 times this week, bringing baskets of supplies. The guards speak of this event in late October with anticipation, but they won't tell us what it means. Some of the women believe it's a celebration of German surrender. Others fear it's a cruel joke. I don't know what to think. Katharina maintained her skeptical distance, warning the younger women not to get their hopes up. Whatever they're planning, it's American. It has nothing to do with us or with the war ending, she insisted, during their evening discussions in the barracks. But even she couldn't fully hide her curiosity when Doc Hayes asked her to help prepare extra medical supplies for what she described as possible celebration needs. The decorations began appearing a week before the Bedford 31st. Orange and black streamers went up in the dining hall. Carved pumpkins with grotesque faces appeared on windowsills and fence posts, candles flickering inside them as darkness fell. To the German women, the leering faces seemed ominous. Were they meant to intimidate the prisoners? The carved faces grinned in the twilight, their expressions impossible to read as friendly or hostile. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson became a regular presence during those final days. She directed decoration efforts with quiet authority, transforming the dining hall into something the prisoners didn't recognize. The abundance of preparation, the obvious expense and effort, all pointed towards something significant. The women watched, waited, and wondered what October 31st would bring. The evening of October 31st arrived with a bite in the air that promised winter's approach. The German women had been instructed to report to the dining hall at 6 o'clock, an unusual time that only heightened their anxiety and hope. They dressed in their cleanest clothes, helped each other fix their hair, and moved as a silent group across the darkening compound. Every step felt weighted with possibility. Tonight, they believed, their fate would be revealed. When they entered the dining hall, the sight took their breath away. The room had been completely transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm golden light across tables laden with more food than they had seen since before their capture. Roasted turkeys, glazed hams, bowls of mashed potatoes swimming in butter, fresh bread still steaming from the ovens, pies of every variety, and vegetables prepared in ways they didn't recognize. The carved pumpkins they had found so ominous now seemed cheerful in the lamplight, their faces flickering with welcoming candlelight. The American guards stood waiting, all of them cleaned up and wearing their dress uniforms. Sergeant Patterson stood at the head of the room with his wife Eleanor beside him. When all the women had entered and stood uncertainly near the doorway, he raised his hand for attention. "Welcome," he said in his slow, clear English. "Tonight, we celebrate Halloween, an American tradition. We want to share it with you." The translator began to relay his words, but Liesl didn't wait for the translation to finish. She stepped forward, her young face desperate with hope. "Sergeant Patterson," she said in her careful English, her voice breaking, "the war, is it over? Is that why we celebrate?" Her question hung in the air like a held breath. Every woman in the room leaned forward, waiting for his answer. Some were already crying, hands clasped in prayer. Others gripped each other's arms, afraid to hope but unable to stop themselves. Patterson's face fell as he understood their assumption. He looked stricken, glancing at his wife, who touched his arm gently. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. "No, the war isn't over. This is just Halloween, an American holiday. We celebrate it every year at the end of October. It has nothing to do with the war." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, like a dam breaking, the emotions flooded out. Liesl collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her hands. Other women sank onto benches, their faces buried in their arms. Some stood frozen, tears streaming down their cheeks in silence. The crushing weight of continued uncertainty, of hopes raised and shattered in a single moment, was too much to bear. They had allowed themselves to believe, and that belief had been ripped away. Hilda stood rigid, fighting to maintain her composure as the natural leader. But even she felt the tears burning behind her eyes. She had let herself imagine going home, seeing her family again, sleeping in her own bed. Now that dream dissolved like smoke. Frida clutched her diary to her chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Katharina, always the strongest, turned her face to the wall so no one would see her cry. For several long minutes, no one moved. The German women remained scattered throughout the hall, some sitting, some standing, all struggling with the weight of their dashed hopes. The American guards stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to the grief they had inadvertently caused. The festive decorations that had seemed so cheerful moments before now felt like mockery. Charlie Reeves looked devastated, his usual smile completely gone. Even Corporal Sutherland, typically stoic, appeared uncomfortable with the pain filling the room. Eleanor Patterson was the first to act. She moved quietly among the crying women, not speaking, simply placing gentle hands on shoulders or offering handkerchiefs from her pocket. Her presence, maternal and kind, seemed to give permission for the grief to flow freely. When she reached Liesl, still kneeling on the floor, she knelt beside her and pulled the young woman into an embrace. Liesl collapsed against her, sobbing like a child, while Eleanor stroked her hair and murmured soft words of comfort. Sergeant Patterson cleared his throat, his own voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry," he said, and the translator's voice wavered as she relayed his words. "We should have explained better. We didn't understand what you were thinking. We just wanted to share something good with you, something normal. We wanted you to have one night that felt less like war." Hilda slowly raised her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She took a shaky breath and stood, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she still possessed. "We thought," she began in halting English, each word carefully chosen. "We thought you celebrate because Germany surrender. We thought we go home." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she forced herself to continue. "We are foolish. We hope for too much." "No," Patterson said firmly, stepping forward. "Hope isn't foolish, and I'm sorry we gave you the wrong hope tonight. But that doesn't mean hope itself is wrong." He gestured to the feast behind him. "This food, this celebration, it's real. Halloween might not mean what you thought, but it's still something we want to share with you. Because you're not just prisoners to us anymore. You're people we've come to know and care about." Katharina stood slowly, her nurse's training helping her regain composure faster than the others. She spoke in German, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "He's right. We allowed ourselves to imagine something that wasn't real, but they didn't do this to hurt us. Look at their faces. They're as upset as we are." She switched to her broken English, addressing Patterson directly. "Thank you for trying to give us something good. We understand now. Halloween is your tradition, not about war." Gradually, the other women began to collect themselves. They wiped their eyes, straightened their clothes, and tried to reclaim their dignity. The crushing disappointment remained, but slowly, curiosity began to emerge alongside it. If this wasn't about the war ending, then what was it about? What kind of people threw elaborate celebrations for their prisoners simply because it was tradition? The meal that followed was quiet at first, tentative. The women sat at the long tables while the American guards served them, an act that felt strange and somehow wrong. Prisoners weren't supposed to be served by their captors. Yet here was Dusty McGraw, carefully spooning mashed potatoes onto plates, and Charlie Reeves offering fresh rolls with butter. Eleanor Patterson moved from table to table, explaining each dish in simple English that the translator relayed into German. This is pumpkin pie. It's traditional for Halloween and Thanksgiving. This is cornbread, sweet corn pudding, green bean casserole. As they ate, the initial shock began to fade, replaced by genuine curiosity. The food itself became a conversation starter. Many of the dishes were completely unfamiliar to the European women. Frida tentatively tasted the pumpkin pie, and her eyes widened with surprise. "It's sweet," she said in German. "We make pumpkin into soup, never dessert." This simple observation sparked discussion. The women began comparing German and American food traditions, using hand gestures when words failed, creating a bridge across the language barrier through the universal experience of sharing a meal. Sergeant Patterson eventually stood and explained Halloween's origins through the translator. He spoke of ancient Celtic traditions, of costumes meant to ward off spirits, of harvest celebrations and community gatherings. He told them how children dressed up and went door to door collecting candy, how families carved pumpkins together, how neighborhoods came alive with decorations and laughter. His voice carried warmth as he described taking his own nephew trick or treating the previous year, the boy dressed as a cowboy, naturally. The explanation helped, but what truly broke the remaining ice was what happened next. Eleanor disappeared briefly and returned with a box of costumes, simple things made from spare fabric and creativity. Masks, hats, colorful scarves. "In America," she announced, "on Halloween, everyone gets to be someone else for one night." She held up a witch's hat, crooked and black, and placed it on her own head with a grin. "Even prisoners and guards can forget who they're supposed to be." The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely playful, that Liesel actually laughed. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it cut through the lingering sadness like a bell. Charlie immediately donned a ridiculous mask made to look like a scarecrow, crossing his eyes and making exaggerated movements that drew more laughter. Dusty found a cape and swept it around his shoulders dramatically, declaring himself a vampire in such terrible German pronunciation that even Katharina smiled. Slowly, cautiously, the German women began to participate. Hilda accepted a colorful scarf and tied it around her head like a fortune teller. Frida put on a mask painted with stars and moons. The absurdity of it, prisoners and guards playing dress-up in the middle of a war, somehow made perfect sense in that moment. The laughter came more easily now, mixing with the lingering tears, creating something neither group had expected to find in a prison camp. They found joy. The Halloween misunderstanding became a turning point at Camp Bitter Creek. In the months that followed, the relationship between guards and prisoners deepened in ways that transcended the boundaries of war. The women had revealed their vulnerability that night, their desperate hope to go home, and the Americans had responded not with mockery but with compassion. Trust, once broken by assumptions, was rebuilt stronger than before through genuine understanding. Winter descended on Montana with fierce determination. Snow buried the compound under blankets of white, and temperatures plunged to depths the German women had never experienced. The guards brought extra blankets, showed them how to layer clothing against the cold, and taught them the American art of building proper fires. Evenings were spent in the common room, where Liesel's singing voice mingled with Dusty's harmonica, creating music that belonged to no single country but to the shared human need for warmth and connection. Christmas came and went with another celebration, but this time the women knew what to expect. They contributed their own traditions, teaching the Americans about Tannenbaum and Still Nacht. The cultural exchange flowed both directions now. Hilda helped Sergeant Patterson improve his German while he taught her the subtle art of reading Montana weather patterns. Katharina and Doc Hayes became true colleagues, discussing medical techniques and sharing knowledge that transcended national allegiances. Spring arrived slowly, tentatively, as if uncertain of its welcome. News from Europe grew more definitive. Germany was collapsing. Cities fell one after another. The women listened to radio reports with mixed emotions, grief for their country's suffering, intertwined with growing understanding of why that suffering had become necessary. The revelations about concentration camps, about the true nature of the regime they had unknowingly served, weighed heavily on their consciences. Frida filled page after page of her diary trying to reconcile who she had been with, who she was becoming. Then, on May 8, 1945, the announcement came. Victory in Europe Day. The war was truly over. This time, there was no confusion, no misunderstanding. The American guards gathered the women in the same dining hall where the Halloween feast had taken place 7 months earlier. Sergeant Patterson stood before them, his weathered face showing the weight of responsibility. "Ladies," he said, his voice steady, "Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. Arrangements are being made for your repatriation." The silence was different this time. Not the shocked hope of Halloween night, but something more complex. Relief certainly, but also fear and uncertainty. What Germany were they returning to? The reports painted pictures of devastation beyond imagination. Cities in ruins, families scattered or lost, a nation that would take generations to rebuild. And something else troubled them, something they had not expected to feel: reluctance. That evening, Hilda sat on her bunk, writing a letter she wasn't sure she would send. Around her, the other women faced similar reckonings. They had been given what they thought they wanted most: the freedom to go home. Yet home had become a complicated concept. Montana, this strange prison camp run by cowboys, had become familiar, safe. The people here had shown them kindness when they deserved judgment. 20 years later, Hilda Schneider-Patterson stood in her kitchen in Billings, Montana, carving pumpkins with her 2 daughters. The autumn sun streamed through windows, overlooking land that had once seemed impossibly foreign, but now felt like the only home she could imagine. Her hands, older now but still steady, guided the knife through orange flesh with practiced ease. Her daughters, 12 and 9, giggled as they scooped out seeds, preparing for Halloween night. Roy walked in from the ranch, his hat dusty from a day's work. He paused in the doorway, watching his wife and daughters with that quiet satisfaction that came from a life well lived. "Remembering?" he asked softly in English, though they often spoke German at home, so the girls would know their mother's language. Hilda nodded, setting down her knife. "Always," she replied. "Every Halloween, I remember that night. How foolish we were. How kind you were." She had been one of 9 women who chose to stay. The repatriation process had offered options for those with no families to return to, for those willing to sponsor themselves into American communities. The Henderson family, the Sutherlands, Doc Hayes, they had all stepped forward to help. But it was Roy Patterson who had quietly asked Hilda if she might consider staying in Montana. Not as a prisoner, but as someone who might want to build a new life. 2 years later, they had married. Liesel had returned to Germany, carrying with her the music and hope she had found in captivity. She wrote letters regularly, now working as a music teacher in Hamburg, helping children find joy in a country still healing from its wounds. Her voice, once raised in tears on Halloween night, now taught a new generation songs of peace. Katharina had stayed, completing her medical degree and opening a practice in Great Falls. She never married, dedicating herself instead to healing others as penance and purpose intertwined. Frida had chosen differently. She published her diary in 1952, a slim volume titled From Enemy to Friend, A German Prisoner's American Journey. The Halloween chapter remained the most powerful, her words capturing that moment when hope and disappointment collided, when enemies became human to each other. Her book was now used in schools across both countries, teaching students about reconciliation and the complexity of wartime identity. The doorbell rang, pulling Hilda from her memories. Charlie Reeves stood on the porch, older now with gray in his hair, but his smile still wide and genuine. He had remained a family friend, Uncle Charlie, to the girls. "Ready for tonight?" he asked, holding up a bag of candy. "Wouldn't miss it," Hilda replied, embracing him warmly. As darkness fell and costumed children began appearing at their door, Hilda watched them with tears of gratitude in her eyes. That Halloween night in 1944, she had believed the war was ending. She had been wrong. But in a deeper sense, She had been right. That was the night her war truly ended, replaced by something she never expected to find: home.